Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is John Vidal. I'm here in Wales, and as you can see from the background, it's raining and whatever. This session really is going to try and sort of link together a lot of stuff which has come before, but also to look outwards at the pandemic as well, which is affecting everybody. And this was very much cast or framed as a medical problem. And of course, it is a medical problem. And we had very, very little about the relationship between pandemics and nature. And so it seemed a very good idea to bring together some of the people who knew more about this than probably anybody else alive. And I've been looking at it for the last 6 or 7 months and really wondering where do all these pandemics and epidemics and things coming from? Are there more of them now than there were? Why are they going so far and so fast? Is it linked to our destruction of nature? What are the underlying causes? Is it population? Is it trade? Is it deforestation? Is it consumption, urbanization, or whatever? Why are we getting them now? Why so many? Are we getting actually more than we ever had before? And looking ahead, is this an awful sort of wake-up call that if we don't address these things now, if we don't address nature now, we are going to get more of these pandemics, and they're going to come over and over and over again, and potentially speeding up. So we have got 3 people with me. I'm going to talk as little as possible. There's 3 people here today. Bob Watson, who has an extraordinary history. He's spent a lifetime telling governments how to address nature, how to get hold of climate change and biodiversity. He was the chair of the great IPBES report, which came out last year, which really was a wake-up call, and I think put biodiversity onto the map on the same level as climate change. And he and thousands of other scientists made those links between the causes of the one and the causes of the other. So Bob, thank you very much indeed for coming. Devil Deb is here from Calcutta. He's in Calcutta. I've known him very much as a seed, not collector, that's the wrong word, but he's the India's seed warrior. He's the man who has, not single-handedly at all, but he's helped save from the brink of extinction thousands of land races and heritage seeds which have really sustained India for eons. But he's also a conservation and a biologist of great renown as well. So he's been working in communities and can tell us really firsthand what is the link between health and if you like, these ancient, agroecological ways of farming. And thirdly, we have John Letts, who is from Oxford, and John is well known as basically someone who has taken England's heritage seeds, and he's seen what's in them, and he's now growing them and distributing them right the way around Britain. So with an extraordinary insight in what can be grown, the yields which can be got from heritage seeds, and the importance they are for health and for ecology and for the future. So welcome all 3 of you. Thank you so much indeed for coming. I'm going to ask each of you to talk just for a few minutes, no more than 7 or 8 minutes, absolute maximum. And then we got questions. So then we'll fire questions to each other, and then you, the audience as well, can please fire in as well. And anyway, here we go. So over to you, Bob Watson, please. Thank you very much indeed.
Good afternoon. First, it's a pleasure to be with you today. We live in a time where human well-being of both current and future generations is being threatened by the interconnected issues of climate change and loss of biodiversity. Today, I'd like to focus on biodiversity. It's clear that human well-being is critically dependent on nature. That is to say, we're dependent on biodiversity, ecosystems, and their services. Nature provides the food, medicines, fiber, materials, and energy. It provides inspiration and learning, physical and psychological experiences, a sense of place, and supports human identities. But it also modulates and maintains Earth systems, providing a stable climate, mitigating natural hazards such as floods and fires, maintaining air and water quality, and supporting biological productivity. Of particular importance to this conference is, of course, food production, which depends not only on the food plants themselves, but on many contributions from nature, including animal pollination, maintenance of soil fertility and water holding capacity, genetic diversity to withstand changes in the Earth's environment. Unfortunately, many pollinators are in decline. Soil fertility is decreasing, and the genetic diversity of plants and animals is also decreasing. The question is, why is biodiversity loss on land? Why are we losing biodiversity? Well, in order of conversion, it's conversion of natural habitats for agriculture and forestry, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. For marine systems, the oceans, is primarily overexploitation. Well, climate change is not currently the most important driver of biodiversity loss. It is likely to become as or more important than these other drivers in the coming decades, unless the governments of the world, working with civil society, working with industry, manage to achieve the Paris target of keeping climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, and preferably keeping it to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's clear that agriculture plays a key role in both climate change and the loss of biodiversity. We need to transform our agricultural systems to be much more sustainable, to reduce their footprint on biodiversity, to reduce their footprint on climate. We need to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. We need to slow down the leaching of nitrogen and phosphorus into the groundwater, our rivers, our lakes, and our coastal systems. And this can easily be accomplished. More use of agroecological practices, organic agriculture, more use of integrated pest and nutrient management, soil and water conservation practices, more use of no-till or low-till agriculture, conservation livestock practices, and agroforestry, amongst many other things we can do. But our interaction with nature can also have adverse consequences on human health via zoonotic diseases, infectious diseases transmitted between humans and animals. The majority of emerging diseases, 70%, for example, Ebola, Zika, and almost all of the pandemics, such as influenza, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, are all zoonosis. There's an estimated 1.7 million undiscovered viruses in mammals, especially in bats, rodents, and primates, and in avian hosts. Of these, between 540,000 and 850,000 could have the ability to affect humans. Livestock, especially cattle, pigs, camel, and poultry, can act as an intermediate transmitter between wild species and humans. The transmission of these diseases is driven by the unsustainable exploitation of nature due to land use change and agricultural expansion and intensification, issues of deforestation, human settlements and crops and livestock production in wildlife areas and urbanizations, wildlife trade and meat consumption, both legal and illegal trade in wildlife. The legal trade of wildlife has increased fivefold in the last 14 years and is worth over $100 billion annually. The illegal trade is estimated to be worth $7 to $23 billion per year. All of these disrupt the natural interactions between wildlife and their microbes, and the increase of humans with a contact with wildlife, livestock, people, and by definition, the pathogens. Pandemics and emerging zoonoses cause a burden on human health, deaths, long-lasting health issues, as well as significant economic damages. There are currently over 85 million cases of COVID-19 today, resulting in nearly 2 million deaths, with an economic cost somewhere between 10 and 20 trillion US dollars. And we haven't seen the last of this pandemic. We need to reduce the risk of future pandemics. It will require a portfolio of preventive actions. We need to promote the responsible consumption of wildlife and wildlife derivative products from emerging disease hotspots. We need to reduce the consumption of meat from livestock. We need to conserve our protected areas. We need to reduce the unsustainable exploitation of high biodiversity regions. We need to reduce wildlife, livestock, human contacts, and this will inhibit the spillover of natural pathogens. There's no question nature is critically important to human well-being, but it can also have adverse consequences on human health in the way that we humans interact with nature in unsustainable ways. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob, very much indeed. I mean, it is really our fault, isn't it? I mean, we have created the conditions for these pandemics to emerge, arise. You know, HIV, SARS, MERS, you name it. Where is the human hand which seems to be behind the whole lot? Devil, come in now, please. Tell us the Indian context of this, please.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John. In fact, Bob's excellent introduction has actually introduced everything about this, the current pandemonium that humanity is facing today. I will just add a few qualitative things now, which is already known to the experts, but many people are still ignoring these at their own, at humanity's peril. I can see this now as an ecologist. I see that humanity as a race, as a species, is now a kamikaze warrior who is running at a great speed toward a sudden and violent death and kill his enemy. The only difference is that in this breakneck speed of kamikaze progress, humans are not going to harm any enemy, but killing their own life support system, and in the process, creating novel, invisible enemies that did not exist before. And industrialization is the aircraft on which this kamikaze warrior, the humanity, is riding and is flying. Industrialization of our production system has radically disrupted the global ecosystem and created systemic maladies in the form of toxins in our food and water, destruction of the environment, ecosystems, and outbreaks of novel pathogens would descend. And this novel pathogens is this COVID is just the last one so far, but it had already, produced many others, as Bob has already mentioned. African swine fever, novel influenza H1N1, and the system of industrialization of the production systems. They create opportunities for many viruses to mutate and spread. It's not just the food production system, but also deforestation, which triggers processes by which previously boxed-in pathogens in natural environments are spilling over into livestock and human communities, which otherwise won't have come into the human societies at all. The other one is the most important, very recent one, is the global warming is melting the permafrost of Siberia and Canada. It has already melted. And scientists feared that this permafrost melt would release numerous ancient pathogens that laid dormant under the ice cover over millennia. Now, these pathogens are natural, and mutations in pathogens is also natural. But the spread of the novel mutant strains and the new pathogens requires a uniform genetic base of the host. This is exactly what is offered on a silver platter to the pathogens by the modern food production system. Industrial agriculture starts by truncating species diversity and genetic diversity on farm by systemic monocultures. It homogenizes the genetic base by eliminating all cropland races, and all breeds of the domestic animal like cattle. The land races and the breeds that were perfectly adapted to the local environmental conditions. But because of this, with the mode of industrial production, the diversity is lost, and there's always some emphasis on monoculture. Industrial farming operations leave animals, therefore, more susceptible to viral infections, and also can sponsor the conditions by which pathogens can evolve to more infectious types. The massive and indiscriminate use of antibiotics and growth promoters in industrial livestock models makes things worse by creating pathogenic strains resistant to such drugs. Like many viruses, various superbacteria are in line for the next pandemics, for which there is no control products available. Large-scale monocultures decimate natural habitats, which can lead to disease emergence. It's not just agriculture, it's in forestry, in fishery. It's always monoculture and monoculture of exotics just for the sake of higher and higher production of these of the products. The corporate control of a globalized food system favors this monoculture system, and this has undermined the food security of the countries, especially the non-industrialized countries or recently industrialized countries and the industrializing countries like India. It has already disrupted the diversified food production systems. It began with Europe, then it spread all over the world. As a consequence, there is a shift from traditional, diverse, and nutrient-rich diets to all the people to highly processed, energy-dense, micronutrient-poor foods. And that's what I call McDonaldization of food cultural diversity. Monocultures are inherently deficient in genes resistant to diverse crop pests and pathogens, and therefore necessitates pumping in of tons of insecticides and fungicides and nematicides and now herbicides too. This intoxication drives to extinction thousands of life forms that made the agroecosystem very complex until the advent of industrialization. This leads to, firstly, a dismantling of sustainability of food production, and secondly, huge public health deterioration from contaminated foods and water. The loss of biodiversity thus costs hundreds of billions of dollars annually in crop production and human health. Agroecology is the only and the last option for us to stop this rapid march towards self-destruction. A mountain of evidence exists to show that agroecology rebuilds soil fertility, effectively controls pests and diseases, enhances food productivity, improves human health, restores equity in food distribution, and reinstates communitarian ethos. Now, an agroecology involves enhancement of biodiversity on species level and genetic level of all crops and domesticated animals. Greater diversity entails more complexity, which in turn entails increase in system resilience, which I will discuss later, which means that more complex systems return to its original steady state after a disturbance more quickly than a simpler system. Now, with this industrialization of our food production system, we are homogenizing the system, we are truncating this diversity at genetic level and species level and ecosystem level so that the resilience is lost, it's crumbled. The stupidity of politicians and policymakers ignore the suggestions from the enormous body of research from the disciplines of ecology and conservation science, and also from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and serve the vested interests of agribusiness and seed industry to destroy the life support systems of all humanity, especially the poor and marginalized sections of society. Agroecology is the only path toward a sustainable future. Yet, the criminals against humanity are working to block this path so that the business goes as usual. So this, I think, with this kind of, caveat in mind, we will start discussing about how to incorporate agroecology in our production system and come out of this to prepare ourselves for the upcoming disasters which are certain to come. Thank you very much.
Devil, thank you very much indeed. A very, very eloquent discussion. John, come in now on the genetic, the diversity which you've been working for so long. Are you seeing that health as well as abundance can be produced from genetic diversity, or what are you finding in Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire?
Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. Various places. I'm speaking from a small holding in the hills of Buckinghamshire. Yes, I think we can achieve both of those things, to have high yields as well as more nutritionally dense food, from looking back to the crops that our ancestors grew, that are still being grown in some parts of the world that haven't been crushed by industrial farming. By, you could argue, probably colonial farming that has come from the UK originally. So I suppose I'm speaking here from, in a sense, the belly of the beast, where we lost long ago the diversity that many cultures still have, like Debal's been speaking about. So in a sense, that makes it harder for us, I suppose, to rebuild. But this conference has been very inspiring, I think, to see 5,000 people all around the world who are appreciating all these things. And whether you're kind of growing organically or regeneratively or sustainably, there are so many words being thrown about that I think the changes, it's so good to see the changes coming. I mean, those were amazing talks we've just heard, and I can't possibly reach the scale of linking them and talking about COVID the way Bob and Debal have done. It can make you feel quite depressed about the task. And as an archaeologist, I spent quite a long time excavating collapsed civilizations in places like Turkey, where you see this combination of climate change and pandemic and crop failure coming together, leading to social collapse. And that could be quite, well, depressing. We're all quite depressed because of this. But I think it's important to try to stay optimistic, and that's what I'll do. I just have a few short slides to present, which shows how I've approached this. The overarching theme here is that, as everyone has been speaking about, is that in diversity there is strength. Nature, ecosystems are all about biodiversity. But there's something I think we don't talk enough about. And I've been coming to all of the real farming conferences from the beginning. At the start of this of the conferences, I think there was a big emphasis on grassland and pasture. And it's wonderful to see how we've moved a little bit more and more towards arable and looking at arable crops. Because as Colin Tudge has always said, we have to get the arable right. And I think that's what we've been missing. And I think there's something I'd like to talk about there, which is more about the plant breeding and the genetic diversity. If we could bring up the slides, if I can do that. How do I do that?
So, John, just go to your PowerPoint and start your slide.
Oh, that's right. Okay, sorry. There we go. Everyone can see that, I hope.
Yes.
Now, I have a dozen slides, and I'll run through them. There's no writing. I just want some fairly pretty pictures for you 12 to see. Now, this is considered by, let's say, the scientific community and by so many as the holy grail of agriculture. These are field plots that I visited over in East Anglia at NIAB, the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. And these are the plots where they grow out to compare and to show farmers, to encourage farmers to grow. This was a couple of years ago, but these are the result of 10-year breeding projects. And this is considered the best crops we could possibly grow here in English conditions. And I think I don't need to spend much time looking at them, that I look at these not as the holy grail, as the gold standard in farming, but as the crops that are destroying the planet. These are green revolution varieties. They're super short. They have shallow root systems. Every plant in that field, well, they're separate plots of different elite varieties, but they're all genetically incredibly similar because they all share pretty much the same genes. They have shallow root systems, so they can't deal with drought. They're so short, they can't compete against weeds. All the things that we know about and hear about they're uniform, they're genetically uniform. And I think there are two design flaws built into this system. One is clearly that the way we grow them has no biodiversity. The ground is sterile, the crop is sterile at every level. And so when a pest evolves or comes in and there's spores of rusts and smuts and bunts and just about every disease in the world falling onto these crops all the time, it's going to get worse with climate change. That there's a smorgasbord for the insects to eat here. They're high in nitrogen, so there's lots of nutritious tissues, and diseases just come in and wipe through these. And we constantly have pandemics of crops, and breeders are constantly trying to breed in genetic diversity. But that's the design flaw in my perspective, is that these crops are selected and designed. The way that's done is a flaw. And it comes down, to me, in my view, a lot to do with nitrogen. Now, the crops I've been developing, and which I think are far more natural to grow and can solve a lot of our problems, fundamentally start with lots of biodiversity in the field when you grow them, but also massive genetic diversity in the crop itself. And what I'm trying to do here is just mimic nature. We all talk about, regenerative farmers love to say, well, we're just mimicking nature. We're regenerating the soil's natural fertility. All of these things are great, but actually, we have to admit, I think, that in even organic farmers or regenerative farmers, whatever you want to call yourself, share a fundamental issue with conventional farming, in that all the crops we're growing are selected and developed to be genetically uniform. The idea is that you have a population or lots of different types of wheat or whatever crop you're dealing with out there. There's a lot of diversity. They can grow tall, short, higher yield, lower yield, and you bring all that diversity together. You spend years and years crossing it and selecting it, and you produce one plant that is the queen of varieties, that has all the characteristics you want, super high yield, all the characteristics you want. But inevitably, those crops are massively dependent on nitrogen. Farmers love to say we convert sunshine into grain to feed our communities. Whether you're organic or conventional, you're not really converting sunshine into grain. You're converting oil into grain, fundamentally. As long as you're tilling and plowing in leaves, spreading fertilizer, spreading manure, spraying all these horrendous agrochemicals onto land, you're really just converting oil into grain, as far as I see it. So I want to go back to the way crops were once grown. I'm an ecologist as well. I've worn a few different hats in my life, but I did grow up on conventional farms in Canada, but I ended up doing a lot of ecological work. And what I'm trying to do here is to mimic what really is in a wild grassland. What is wheat? What is rye? These are wild grasses that grew in the Near East 10,000 years ago that were taken into cultivation. Ultimately into cultivation, but not for the first 5,000 or 6,000 years. In fact, for the first half of our relationship with cereals, with grasses, we didn't till, we didn't plow. There's no evidence of plowing until quite late in the archaeological record. The earliest crops were actually probably broadcast or perhaps lightly harrowed in. They were just managed patches. And what happens in nature? Well, the seed grows on the surface of the ground. There's a lot of organic matter at the surface when the crops fall over. There's a little bit of grazing and a tiny bit of manure from wild ruminants. But in fact, there's very little nitrogen in the system. So our ancient crops are designed for very, very low nitrogen. In fact, the biggest problem in farming until 200 years ago was, the biggest challenge was to keep nitrogen levels low. But of course, we've become obsessed by nitrogen because all of our plant breeding is designed to find those genotypes, those varieties that can convert the most nitrogen possible as quickly as possible into grain. And as I say, it doesn't matter what system you use, as long as we're locked into that mindset that we have to maximize nitrogen to have yield or to have useful crops, I think that we're going to be locked into destroying ecosystems, and we're never going to get there. We're like a dog chasing his tail. So I think there are ways of doing this that don't involve rotation, that don't involve manuring, that where we aren't obsessed. And immediately people are going to say, well, can we produce enough food? Well, I think that's possible. I think by rewilding the wheat field itself, rather than rewilding the land and planting trees and everything else on it, I think we can do both things. And I think that, I'll get lower yields. I'll get 1.2, 1.3 tons an acre by growing it using this system. But I get that every year. So I can produce, a considerable amount of grain over a 5-year rotation, for example. But in an organic system, you need to build 3 years of a nitrogen building ley into the system and then plow that down so that you can plant one crop of modern commercial wheat, suck out maybe, if you're lucky, 2 tons of grain, but then all the nitrogen's exhausted. So, organic farming was developed pretty much to raise animal production. And the first, the Norfolk four-cross rotation was actually a Flemish rotation that came in before that. And that was designed really to increase the output of animal products. I think we need to produce more grain because I think it's conventional grain farming that is destroying the planet, and we're not producing enough organic grain. So I'm just going to flick through some slides of the type of work that I've been doing here. This is a crop. It could be the Middle East. It looks a bit like that. This is actually a field down in Berkshire at Sheep Drove Organic Farm. And I want to point out the weeds at the beginning. We're raised to think weeds are our enemies, but they're not. It depends which one. I don't like thistles. I don't like charlock, but they're contributing a lot of nutrients to the system. And this crop is also undersown with clover, and it's a very sustainable agro ecosystem. I don't think we should lose touch of that. I think we can create vibrant agro ecosystems that preserve that biodiversity that Bob and everyone has been talking about. But we can also, but to have the resilience that Vidal was just talking about, we need genetic diversity in the crop itself. So I'm just going to run through these. In a UK context, the truth is we lost our genetic diversity a long time ago. To find out what these ancient crops were like in the UK, we have to go back to the medieval period. That seems a very long way, but that's as long as we've lost our crops. It goes way back. So in the top left, there's a photo of someone broadcasting seed. Our ancestors clearly did save seed from year to year. This selected for complementarity, you should call them in crops. But those varieties that grew well together and grew best in the local conditions produced more seed, were saved from year to year, and gradually developed what we call land races. And there's a lot of genetic diversity built into these land races, and they can deal with climate change. They can deal with different soil conditions. The green in the middle slide shows how genetically diverse they were because they didn't all ripen at the same time. And luckily, and I think this is the only place in Europe where this has happened, we actually have direct archaeological evidence of what those crops were. That's rye breaking out of a roof that was thatched in 1450 in Oxfordshire. So that gives us direct evidence of those types of crops. But the grain, sadly, is dead because a cereal seed won't last for more than 4 or 5 years without being frozen. It dies. So all the stories of grain from King Tutankhamun's tomb and ancient grain silos, I'm afraid, is not right botanically. And in these crops, there's all sorts of diversity. Diversity that, well, according to the wheat experts, some of these wheats that I'm finding in these medieval roofs didn't even evolve, but there they are. So there's no doubt that our ancestors in the UK grew incredibly diverse, genetically diverse crops of cereals. But we were also the first country to industrialize. So, by the late 1700s, early 19th century, early 1800s, you get mechanization. You get a shift to reaper binders instead of sickles, and you get a move to threshing machines rather than flails. So that completely depopulated the countryside. Patterns that are obviously still occurring in many parts of the global south. Other parts of the world happened a bit later. But basically, people left the country, and we had intensive systems develop. And that was partially to compete against all the imports of grain we were bringing in from the colonies, from Canada, from all over, and from other places through free trade. And that challenged British growers because we can grow amazingly high-yielding crops in the UK, but we don't have the gluten, the high protein that bakers wanted to make fluffy white bread full of water that they could sell for more profit. That's basically the way it is. And it reached a point that in the 1880s, wheat production in the UK collapsed. People basically stopped growing wheat. And over that period, we lost our genetic diversity in the field. And very, very little was collected for gene banks. So today, what do we have of our traditional crops? Well, we have lots of writings, lovely photos, or photos, engravings. We have a tradition of, of folklore, of some corn dollies and things like that link us, our songs, our food. We have plowmen's meals, and our songs are all about this. And we have a thatching industry, which I keep hearing people talk about as a reservoir of these old varieties. Really, there's only one old variety that's used to a small degree in thatching, and I've been involved for thatching I was involved for a very long time. They're all growing modern varieties, not heritage varieties. Varieties developed in the 1970s because they're a bit shorter, a bit quicker to put on, a bit more profitable. So in our gene banks, we have 30, 40, 50 old types of wheat that have pretty much accidentally ended up there. So we have very little diversity left of what we once had here in the UK. So to rebuild those populations, we have to go beyond our own collections in the gene banks. Now, gene banks get a lot of flack, and they are, very much supporting the corporate plant breeding industry. But they do still contain the diversity that we need if we're going to rebuild these systems, the people, the smaller farmers. And it's getting a little more difficult to get those seeds out of gene banks, but thank God they're there. But we have to draw on the diversity outside of the UK. So this is a population that I rebuilt and have been growing for about 15 years. Some of you will know Holly from Totnes, who's communing with the population over in Totnes. And you can see from that field that it's very different from that first Green Revolution field slide I showed. There's immense diversity in this field. And this was an incredibly productive crop that produced some beautiful flour, made some lovely bread. And there's no doubt that it grew very well in Totnes. It makes lovely bread. Now, there's a great artisan bread movement that's been developing the last few years. But I have to say, I'll be blunt, until very recently, most bakers were really not interested in growing these grains. And I've been developing these heritage grain populations for about 25 years. Now, there's no doubt they're tasty, and they grow well as pure line varieties. You can make very lovely, quite tasty and unusual bread from them. But purity, the more uniform they are, the greater risk they won't do well in the field because of climate, because of soil conditions. A lot of these varieties went out of cultivation, often because they were too tall and they'd fall over if there was any nitrogen. But they just didn't work in the field as pure line varieties. So fine to bake with. I don't have a problem with pure line heritage varieties. And that term is so debated. To me, heritage has to be equated with genetic diversity. That's why I link the two. Just because something's 20 years old and no longer on the national list doesn't make it heritage to me. And wonderfully, and some people might be upset by this, but the way I've been paying the bills and getting my research forward over the past few years has been using this grain to make distilled alcoholic drinks, but also beer. Some will say beer, well, that's okay. That's more like cereal soup and can be quite nutritious. But distilling is something different. But I have to say that some of my greatest critics who don't like the fact that I've sold grain for alcohol have never bought a kilo of flour from me over the past 10 years, even though they have very large bakeries. So I'm going to continue to do this. I think we have to use the market to produce products that, to me, will allow me to continue the research I'm doing. What's more important, however, so they work in the sense of consumers, but they work in the field. Now, one of the problems of producing so much lovely flour for bread is one of the joys is working with bakers like Kate Hamblin in Oxford, who produces lovely bread. And you can see the impact that's had on my waistline in that photo on the left. But more importantly, if you can get your eyes off of that, it's that photo on the left is our 2 bundles of wheat cut from 1 square meter plots at the end of the season in Oxford, and we'd had a terrible drought that year. Now the variety on the left is called Skyfall, and a modern dwarf Green Revolution type wheat, and you can see what its yield's going to be. The one on the left is a special blend we're growing near Oxford, and you can see the biomass, and biomass equates with yield. Now, and if you chop all that straw down and it stays on the field, you'll see an incredible contribution of biomass to the soil, to the topsoil. But the grain was wonderful, and it's a very, very productive crop. basically they have massive root systems and they can deal with this type of weather. In fact, the grain quality is improved by drought when you grow mixed populations, as I say. That's the key. And the photo on the right, some of you know David Wilson, who's 6'2", so that's 1.8 meters or thereabouts. And he's standing in a field of rye, a population I developed from rye I initially obtained from around the world. And he's reaching up to lines that are over 2 meters in height, which is very medieval, produces massive amounts of straw, but a good stable crop of grain every year and all I need is 1.2 tons of grain to make this system work very well in a profitable way. And so I'm nearing the end. I hope I've not quite run out of time yet. But so this whole concept, they can be grown in normal organic rotational systems. Forget growing them conventionally because you add nitrates and they fall over. They'll grow 2.5 meters tall and fall over and you won't have any yield whatsoever. But you can grow them in rotational systems. But the problem is too much nitrogen. If you grow them in the standard organic rotation with 3 years of clover building lay, and then you manure and you plow that in, the crops have a risk of falling over because these are ancient varieties, much more closely related to those ancient lines from the Near East. And they're very, very good at converting nitrogen into straw, not grain. So the challenge in medieval farming was
warning.
Low. Sorry, 1 minute, 2 minutes?
Oh, yeah, just if you could wrap up in the next couple minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So you have to keep nitrogen levels low. And of course, that's not even arguing about the destruction you're doing to the soil ecosystem and to the agro ecosystems that's living on that field. So I've been developing a system where this is the last crop of a 6-year experiment where I grew cereals in the same field, a population of heritage grain, same field for 6 years. It's undersown with clover. So I harvest the grain high on the stem. I broadcast grain into that stubble, and it's got lots of clover, as I say, and weeds and all of that. And then I just mow it, and I walk away, and I come back the next year. And that chopped straw forms a mulch over the grain. The grain grows, because remember, these older varieties, and grain in general is developed for growing on the steppes of Central Asia where they weren't tilled, they weren't plowed, they lay on the surface. But this mulch above it forms, keeps the birds away, and the slow breakdown of that straw is what slowly feeds nitrogen to the crop. And it works, and I'm experimenting that on a small scale. That's corn plants, maize. I mean, white clover is wonderful. So we have to find ways of having that biodiverse community in the field, but also genetic diversity at the crop level. And that's the crop of corn, or one of the much more than that, came off of those garden plots. That's slightly relating to the wonderful talk I heard the other night about corn in Ecuador. It's just a very visual representation of genetic diversity. And that's going to be the key, I think, of farming going forwards. And in fact, in the UK, with the way the climate is changing, I predict that in 20 years, we'll be eating a lot more tortillas and many fewer crumpets and loaves of bread, because I think we can grow maize here. 35 years ago, when I first came to Britain, growing maize, corn for seed, was quite rare, only sweet corn. But so I've been developing a really tough, resilient crop up here at 200 meters where I live in Buckinghamshire. That ripens well in British conditions. Last slide. So I think the future, as we all say, is in our hands. In the UK situation, in most European countries, we have to rely on the genetic diversity in our gene banks. And in the UK, I don't think we have enough in our own gene bank, or we have quite a lot, but I don't think we should limit ourselves. If we're going to rebuild these resilient mimics of the land races of our ancestors, we have to think more broadly than that. And we also have to find a way of getting this out to farmers. It's happening in the commercial area, but we also have to make sure that we're going to be able to pass that diversity on to the next generation of farmers. And I think we can do it. The fact that there are 5,000 people at this conference and who are interested in this approach. So I think the key is to challenge the existing plant breeding paradigm and narrative about nitrogen, about uniformity, rewild our cereal fields. And I think we can do that. We may have to move animals onto grass, and we don't need ruminants in our produce lots of crops of cereals. And we certainly don't need genetic modification, which to me is just creating more of that uniformity. We need diversity. In diversity, there is strength. And sorry if I repeated so much of what others have said, but I haven't said too much about COVID, but it's obvious. Uniformity equals disease. Genetic diversity equals strength. So thank you for listening. Thanks. John,
where are you? Thank you. Thank you for that really comprehensive look at how you're achieving diversity. It's really fascinating. I'd never seen it so well expressed in the pictures. That's absolutely brilliant. Devil, can I bring you back in here? Bring it back into health and this genetic. How does the diversity? How does that actually feed back into health and also into protection against pandemics and things like that? So it's how does the health of the soil, the health of the farming reflect into the health of humans as well, please?
Well, the biodiversity at the agricultural system, like rice and wheat, has nothing to do with COVID. I mean, to control COVID by itself, but this is a very good indication how different strains of the same viruses. I mean, this coronavirus is nothing new. Coronavirus has been here for millions of years, but this particular strain is killing humans for the first time in the history of the earth. Similarly, there are many other pathogens, bacteria and fungi and nematodes and viruses whose novel strains are continually evolving. And because the resistant genes incorporated in the built-in insurance of the cropland races, which were already there over thousands of years. Remember that rice was domesticated in India about 12,000 years ago. Wheat was domesticated about 10,500 years ago in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, and so on and so forth. So over these thousands and thousands of years of domestication and crop breeding experiences by ancient, unknown, unnamed farmer scientists, they had already built these particular genomes which are perfectly adapted to local environmental conditions that included the diseases, pathogens, and pests. Now, when these the different strains of pests, insects, for example, or disease agents like pathogens like bacteria and viruses are evolving with this monoculture format of industrial agriculture, which John Letts has beautifully described, we have described this genetic diversity, that wealth of genetic diversity, and therefore now we do not have the arsenal to fight this. This is the meaning of genetic diversity. Genetic diversity means the built-in insurance against crop pests and pathogens. We have already lost this. Now, I have to also mention one point, which John has already mentioned, that there are many varieties which are high yielding. In fact, the only and the major point in support of industrial agriculture is that we have to produce more and the yield is higher than the traditional crop varieties. This is the myth, because the very definition of yield is completely distorted. The scientific definition of yield of anything is the amount of output per unit of input. Okay, so if you give X amount of input to two different crop varieties and you get Y amount of input, which is say 5 quintals per acre in one crop and 2 quintals per acre in another crop with the same amount of input, then we can say that the second crop is low yielding and the first one is high yielding. But I'm actually working with 1,450 varieties of rice over the past 25 years. And we are growing 35 different varieties of aubergines and many other crops. We have never ever seen one single landrace which is lower yielding by that definition compared to any modern high yielding varieties. Simply because if you take into account the amount of input, whether it's water or nitrogen inputs or money for pesticides, any kind of thing, you get it I'm just giving a few very stark examples. On my own farm, we are growing 25 different varieties of rice, which do not need a single drop of water for irrigation after transplanting. And they yield about 1 quintal to 2 quintals per acre. Would you call this high yielding? I think this is the highest yield possible in the world for any variety of rice, which can grow on zero water input. You take any of these so-called high yielding variety, including genetically modified crops, they will just wither away in drought. The opposite is, we have in my own crop, on my farm, we have 27 varieties which can grow in 12 feet deep water. I repeat, 12 feet deep water. And the farmers have to harvest this rice on board a canoe. Can you imagine any damn high yielding variety to be harvested in 5 feet deep water, 3 feet deep water, which stands for 3 months at a stretch? And now we are comparing this yield with this. So this is the, people don't, the agronomists, the university agriculturists, and the seed companies never say that this is high yielding, provided there is adequate water supply and optimum water condition, optimal soil condition, optimal seasons, temperature and so on and so forth. Then only you can get this amount of water. And provided you get enormous quantity of high inputs, whether it's nitrogen input, potassium, phosphorus, water, all of these. John Letts had already explained that there was absolutely not necessary, and that's where we're talking about agroecology, which is qualitatively different from the loosely spoken organic agriculture. This is very important point for many of the, I know many of the audience people are confused about why we are not using organic. Organic by definition is zero synthetic chemicals to be used. Okay, so anything that you can grow without any input of synthetic agrochemicals is organic by definition. But if you are growing this high yielding variety, industrial seeds, or genetically modified seeds like BT cotton or BT rice with cow dung, that is organic by definition, but it's certainly not agroecological, because it's not sustainable, because you remain continuously dependent on the external agencies for the production. That's why it may be organic, but it's not agroecological. We are talking about agroecology. John has very beautifully explained about agroecology, where we are employing the ecological components of the agroecosystem into the production system without any kind of external input. The goal of sustainability is to make it zero external input dependency. And that's the goal of agroecology. And that means, one individual farmer cannot become sustainable. One single farm cannot become sustainable unless this farm is a part of a commons, is a community. It has to be a communitarian ethos. And agroecology is not just the ecological system, but it's a broader ecological system where it includes human ecosystem that includes community. So seed bank, for example, in order to get this kind of supply of the seeds and the organic inputs into the soil, you have to build a community where you can depend within the same community, not going outside. So no machinery, no diesel, no fossil fuel. And for that, you need a communitarian ethos of sharing, exchanging of materials, exchange of energy, input of energy, human energy and animal energy, and of course, sharing of knowledge, not just an external World Bank expert or a university expert advising this local farmer how to do it, when to do it, what to grow, and when to harvest, and so on and so forth. That's the primary emphasis of agroecology. And we have to come out of this, the quantitative yield consideration. Even when we consider this yield per se, just the quantity aspect of output, even on that count, I have 12 varieties on my farm which actually outperform the third generation high yielding variety of rice with zero external input. They out yield So when this IR 36 and IR 72 yield the recorded government record of this output of this particular rice variety is 5.5 tons per hectare. Our variety, there's 12 varieties, actually the output is 6.2 to 6.8 ton per hectare. So that is absolutely hiding. So we have to explode that myth that traditional varieties are low yielding. I would just know one more point about this yield. I consider this is a semantic imperialism. When we talk about yield, high yielding variety, you are growing one variety. You don't know what exactly, whether it's higher or lower. Now, one expert comes to you and says, now take this IR36, this is high yielding variety. By definition, the farmers are inculcated into believing that all other varieties are by definition low yielding. So even if this particular variety that the farmer was growing was already high yielding, they would abandon it because they were inculcated into believing that this must be low yielding. High yielding label is that IR36 and nothing else. This kind of semantic imperialism has also destroyed this genetic diversity, and many farmers have abandoned their own traditional wealth of land races. Thank you. More later.
Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Bob, come in. You're a lot of echo here. You're dealing with government all the time. They're getting the message that ecology is important. Is this completely barren ground for them? Do they have any ecological literacy at all?
Sorry, there's a lot of echo on the line. Who are you asking? Do they have any ecological literacy?
Bob, it's me asking whether you think governments, you deal with governments on that level. Is there any emerging evidence that they are understanding the biodiversity problem and they're really getting to grips with why this is causing these pandemics and illnesses?
I think the answer is yes. I believe over the last 10, 20 years, governments around the world and the private sector, which is equally important, have started to understand the importance of both climate change as an issue and the biodiversity issue. I do believe that the large report, the global assessment that we issued last year, the IPBES report, probably, as you said earlier in this show, has now put biodiversity on a similar level to climate change as a serious issue. I think what governments have finally started to realize, and the private sector, is that while climate change and biodiversity are environmental issues, they are also development issues. They affect food, water security, human health. They're economic issues. They both cause damage to the economy. They're social issues. There are distributional effects between different types of people. There's social, moral, ethical issues. And I think now what everyone is realizing, as both governments, or many governments, not all governments, and the private sector, is you cannot achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, unless we deal with climate change and biodiversity together. Only this week, there was a One Planet meeting of which there was a dozen heads of state. Macron was one of them, who truly understands why biodiversity is an important issue beyond just for environmental reasons. He understands the link to climate change. So I think the question will be, when we get to the convention later on this year on climate, and then separately on biodiversity, will the governments, working with civil society, working with the private sector, will they have the political will to make the changes we need? I think this pandemic has indeed opened the eyes of many that it is our interaction with nature that has both positive and negative consequences. It is very clear we have to stop converting our land. So any food we produce must not be at the expense of pristine forests, pristine grasslands, mangrove swamps, etc. And I think the governments are starting to realize this more and more. I think there has to be more education on the pandemic. It isn't just wildlife trade in markets in China, Southeast Asia. It is the fact we are exposing ourselves more and more to wildlife with these unique diseases, pathogens, and we also are exposing our livestock to these diseases. So we do have to do more education on the issue, but I think people, governments and the private sector are starting to move in the right direction.
Devil, are you finding the same in India? Are you pushing at an open door now? Has the pandemic begun to really make politicians and local people more interested in diversity? Is there any greater understanding now than there was? No.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to. The tribal farmers, the tribal peasants were already aware of the meaning of biodiversity in their own farms, in their own ecosystem. But politicians never learn. I mean, in contrast with what Bob said, there are many, extremely dumb government and extremely greedy private sector, which would never learn. So in this year itself, 175,000 hectares of pristine forest was given over to Adani company for destruction, for setup of this, as if this is a response to climate change and all of this. And similarly, Adani is also given 170 billion rupees loan, which was waived for destroying the coral reef in Australia. So that continues every year. So we are really frustrated that the government will never learn. Our own Prime Minister once said, when he was asked about this climate change, he said very poetically or philosophically, I don't know, you can set up this meaning, that climate is not changing, it's humans who are changing. That's the poetic answer of the Prime Minister. Anyway, that's the situation, and I'm not very hopeful about the politicians and policymakers, whom I consider they are the enemies and the enemies of humanity, I would say.
Bob, come back in.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly varies. I mean, clearly the president of Brazil is a disaster. He's actually got, I mean, he's asking farmers to inappropriately exploit the Amazon. Russia has not signed up to any agreement under the Paris Climate. In the US, we're in a terrible state. I'm optimistic that now we've got Biden, or we will have Biden as the president, not Trump. But Trump clearly doesn't care about any environmental issues, and nor do most of the Republicans. So it is, I mean, I would agree with Devil, it's a mixed bag. But we cannot give up on politicians. We cannot give up on the private sector. We have to show them that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of action. That if we don't stop climate change, or at least limit climate change, there are major economic implications in the future. So self-interest should get these governments, hopefully, and the private sector to the table. So I agree with Devil that it's a very mixed bag. I can go through country by country, and it's but we must continue to argue for a more sustainable future. That's why the document I'm co-leading for UNIT talks about, if we continue business as usual, we're in real bad shape. However, there are many opportunities through technology, policies, practices, individual behavioral changes that can make a real difference, and they are both economically and socially acceptable. So we've got an education job, and we can't. So I don't totally disagree with Devil. I'm probably on the optimistic side. I think he's a tad on the pessimistic side, but we can't give up. We have to keep working at this issue.
Of course not. I'm not giving up on the people. I mean, the producers themselves, only the topicalons. That's why I'm still working with Disney. Anyway, thank you, Bob. It's excellent talk. Yeah.
I sorry to interject, but we would like to move this session over to our Zoom room. If you look at your private chat, you'll find a Zoom link. Please follow that link to the Zoom room to continue the discussion. And all the delegates over in Crowdcast, you can also follow that link in the chat, and if you want to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.